Good evening. Welcome back to Haunting the Fireside, a series about ghosts and other mythical things. In tonight's episode, we will explore two stories that come from the southern coast of Maine: the wreck of the Isidore and the Cape Neddick Lighthouse. In November of 1842, 36-year-old Captain Leander Foss of Maine was preparing to make a maiden voyage with his new ship, the Isidore. He and his crew of 15 men were scheduled to ship out with a heavy cargo from the village of Kennebunkport to the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Foss was confident that this voyage would be a success, despite his unlucky past with ships and sailors. According to the Kennebunk Historical Society, Foss had been serving as captain of another ship, the Horace, just years earlier, when several members of his crew staged a mutiny against him. He managed to survive, and was able to bring the conspirators to justice. However, the Horace was severely damaged by gale force winds. The vessel had been totaled. The remnants and undelivered cargo had to be either auctioned off or scrapped. It is said that parts of the Horace were used to construct the Isidore, the second ship that Foss would go on to command, and which would prove to be his last. In the days leading up to the Isidore's departure from Kennebunkport, some strange things had happened. A sailor named Thomas King, who in one account is referred to as Joe B., approached Foss with a terrible dream that he had had the night before. In the dream, King stood on a beach as he watched a ship being battered by harsh wind and waves before it vanished into a cloud of thick fog. Its crew, which had been thrown overboard, thrashed around in the sea's black, icy waters until they drowned to death. The nightmare ended when the corpses of the sailors washed up on shore, their faces frozen as if they were made of stone. King voiced his concern that this dream might be a bad omen, and requested that he be given leave from sailing on the Isidore at the end of the month. Foss, being a headstrong and practical man, dismissed King's belief in the significance of his dream as superstition, and demanded the sailor to be present at the time of departure. Besides, King had already received a month's pay in advance. Although King wanted to obey the captain's orders, he had his reservations. If we look at this from a realistic point of view, such a dream could be attributed to anxiety about embarking on a long voyage, especially if it is for the first time. But sailors are historically known to hold nearly everything in the seafaring life as ominous. naming a ship, killing an albatross, carrying a coffin on board, just to name a few examples. Maybe it was bad luck to have reused the damaged parts of the Horus to build the Isidore. After all, King's dream was not the only one of its kind to plague the Isidore's crew. The next day, another sailor went to Foss with a dream of his own. The man described a vision of 7 coffins lying on a deserted beach under an overcast sky. He moved tentatively towards the coffins. As he approached, he saw what lay within. The corpses of his fellow crew members. The most terrifying detail for him was that, in one of the coffins, lay his own dead body. Like Thomas King, this sailor interpreted his dream as some kind of premonition. Once again, Foss scoffed at what he took to be irrational and unfounded fears. Nothing would alter his decision about going ahead with the voyage. The morning of November 30th, 1842, the date of the Isidore's departure, was already showing signs of bad weather. A sharp wind whipped the ocean into tempestuous waves, and in the afternoon, billowy clouds above threatened to unleash a fierce storm at any moment. By the early evening, the shore of Kennebunkport was covered in snow from a blizzard that had swept in from the northeast. The time to lift anchor and put out to sea was fast approaching. Typically, families and friends would be excited to send their men off with cheers and hopeful well-wishing. On this occasion, however, they bade a sober, worried farewell. If the sailors feared for their own safety in the face of these treacherous conditions, they remained outwardly stoical. None of them changed their minds about their choice to set sail, regardless of the weather, all except for one individual. Thomas King, the man who was the first to speak about his dream to Captain Foss, was not about to tempt fate. All day long, he hid in the woods that overlooked the bay, keeping out of sight. When Foss searched, but was unable to find King, he concluded that King was not worth the effort. From his vantage point, King waited for the crew to board the ship without him. When that time came, he watched the Isidore drift into a blinding haze of snow and fog. Once he was certain the ship was gone for good, King made his way back home. Upon discovering that he had stayed behind, some of King's acquaintances are said to have thought he was a ghost. Others viciously ridiculed him for being too afraid to join his crew, all because of a dream. However, their laughter and jokes did not last long. Early the next morning, bad news came to Kennebunkport. Residents from York, a city further down the coast, reported that a ship ran aground somewhere between Bald Head Cliffs and Cape Neddick. The vessel, although seriously damaged, was able to be identified by onlookers. It was the Isidore, or rather, what was left of her. Only a handful of the crew washed ashore. 7 of them, to be exact. All had perished, either from drowning or from the extreme below-freezing temperatures. Among the dead was the man who had seen the 7 coffins in his dream. As for Captain Leander Foss, his body was never found. In the years to come, the wreck of the Isidore would become a fireside tale across Maine and the rest of coastal New England. In his book, Famous New England Lighthouses, historian and folklorist Edward Rowe Snow documented anecdotes that he collected from local fishermen. The fishermen claimed to have seen a ghostly ship cruising past the Isles of Shoals, a group of islands on the border between Maine and New Hampshire. These men described the crew as having shadowy figures, with water dripping from their clothes, as if they had just climbed out of the ocean. The sailors stood motionless at their stations on deck and stared dead ahead as the ship continued aimlessly on its course. When bystanders would call out, or if another boat had sailed toward it, the ship would simply disappear. However, no recent sightings of the Isidore and her spectral crew have been recorded. Now, before we continue, I'd like to point out that some of the sources that talk about the Isidore shipwreck seem to cast doubt on the prophetic dreams element, either intentionally or unintentionally, and frames them more as a literary device, as if that part of the story is mere legend. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to verify whether the crew members really did have those dreams. Much has been written about the prophetic significance of dreams by philosophers and scientists throughout history, so the subject is obviously worthy of attention. Because of that, I'm not going to quickly dismiss the possibility of dreams and prophecy at play in this case. However, I have been unable to locate a source that examines, from beginning to end, the details of this story. I think an exhaustive approach like that would help settle the score. It is unknown what exactly took place the night the Isidore went down. The ship appeared to have been broken up by the storm and waves during the night. Struck by strong winds, Foss's ability to navigate was likely impaired by the dark night and the dense fog that surrounded him and his crew. But perhaps this could have been prevented entirely had there been a lighthouse somewhere close by. 3 decades later, in 1879, state and federal officials responded by constructing a lighthouse station in the vicinity of where the disaster occurred. The result was the Cape Neddick Lighthouse Station, better known as Nubble Light. Today, it is among the world's most famous of lighthouses. Every year, tourists flock to Sohere Park in York, Maine, to see the beacon-like structure standing against the dual background of sea and sky. With all of its romantic beauty, some people think the area is home to a spiritual presence. William O. Thompson, who has written extensively about the lighthouses of Maine, suggests that the lighthouse gives off a strong energy that positively affects visitors. Thompson tells of lighthouse keepers, in the time before the station was automated in 1987, who never wanted to leave their post on the island, and of tourists who speak favorably of their visits to the attraction. In one particular account, a woman had been suffering marriage troubles, which culminated in a divorce. Angry and confused, she had become intent upon ending her own life, but was unsure of how to carry out the death wish. Early one morning, she got in the car and drove hundreds of miles north with no conscious sense of direction. Hours later, she arrived in York, Maine, just as dawn was approaching. When she reached Sohier Park, she stopped, stepped out of the car, and walked over to the ledge that faced Nubble Light. Gazing at the lighthouse, she was about to throw herself into the ocean when she saw the sun rising over the horizon. At that moment, an uplifting sense of peace and tranquility came over her, driving away her suicidal tendencies. As the good spirits quelled and replaced the bad, the woman came away from her mystical experience with a joyful outlook on the life that, from that moment onward, she chose to keep. I myself have visited the area of York Beach and Nubble Light many times, and while I agree that it's very nice there, never on any of those occasions did I feel any kind of spirit or energy. To me, the sentiment or experience seems to be more emotional than anything. At the same time, I'm not well versed enough in the literature of spirituality and mystical experiences to either corroborate or dispute this. I will say that, at various times and places in my life, I have been overcome by some powerful feeling, which I can only describe as euphoria or elation. These experiences have taken place when listening to certain kinds of music, especially ambient or atmospheric instrumental songs, being in a certain place, such as a mountaintop, or observing certain weather phenomena, such as sunsets. Maybe these circumstances were brought on by some metaphysical cause, maybe some of them were and others were not, or it could be that none of them were and there's really something natural at work. When I was studying psychology at college, I came across the figure of Abraham Maslow. One term that occurs in his work is what he calls peak experiences, which are basically moments in which a person suddenly realizes one's purpose in life, or one's ability to achieve one's goals. The definition and description of the concept seems to be very similar to the spirit of Nubble Light that Thompson is discussing. These two stories, taken together, create an interesting duality. The first, a tragedy in which lives have been lost to a tumultuous storm and an empty darkness. The second, in which lives are edified and even saved by both a literal and a figurative beacon of light. I will provide a list of resources in the description of this episode for listeners to consult and make up their own minds about the accounts of the Isidore shipwreck, the alleged sightings of the ghost ship, and the spirit or positive energy force at Nubble Light. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks for listening, and keep on reading.